She's resigned to a life of hardship. But when Jasmine Crockett steps in with a life-changing offer, Estella's world is turned upside down, revealing the true cost of a system built on inequality. Can a single act of compassion really break the chains of an unjust life, or will it all fall apart? One question remains. Will Estella's new chance at life be enough to heal the wounds of years spent invisible? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C. pulsed like a wounded machine that night, 10:45 p.m., and the marble skeleton of the Capitol still glowed under sterile white floodlights. Inside, hours earlier, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had delivered a blistering argument against the systemic abuse of part-time workers, a hearing where CEOs shifted blame and senators stared at their watches. Now her heels clicked with purpose across cracked pavement as she crossed Constitution Avenue alone, the chill biting through her coat. Hunger gnawed at her, but it wasn't just for food, it was for clarity. She stepped into a dimly lit 24-hour convenience store, fluorescent lights humming like a dying confession booth. The air smelled of old coffee and antiseptic, and that's when she saw her. A janitor in her 60s, bones visible under a baggy uniform, hunched over a mop like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes didn't just look tired, they looked resigned. Jasmine froze mid-step, her political instincts prickling. The woman moved with such fragile deliberation, cradling a small plastic grocery bag like it held the last chance for dignity. As the woman shuffled past the automatic doors and disappeared into the fogged-up darkness, something inside Jasmine snapped. A thread pulled too tight for too long. She stepped forward to pay for her snack, but stopped short, gripping the counter, her mind elsewhere. That woman didn't just look poor, she looked invisible, erased in plain sight. Jasmine had just spent 10 hours fighting on paper for people like her, only to walk into a living reminder that the system didn't care. No security escort, no Uber waiting, no rest after back-breaking labor, just a bag of marked-down groceries and a long walk into oblivion. Every second the door creaked open for a new customer, none of whom even glanced in the woman's direction. Jasmine glanced out the window. The figure was almost gone now, swallowed by the night. And then, as if pulled by something ancient and unrelenting, Jasmine Crockett made a decision. She would follow, not as a congresswoman, not as a hero, but as a witness, because tonight the city's silence was no longer acceptable. And just like that, the woman who had spent the entire day confronting injustice in a marble chamber of power was now staring into the very face of it. Raw, quiet, and walking away into the cold without anyone noticing. Jasmine stood at the edge of the sidewalk like she was at the edge of a cliff. Behind her, the hum of neon lights and sliding doors faded into irrelevance. Ahead, the janitor's frail silhouette wavered beneath the stuttering orange of a dying street lamp, shrinking with every uneven step into the night. For a fleeting second, Jasmine thought of turning around, returning to her car, and resuming the comforts of being needed, respected, heard. But that moment dissolved the instant she looked again. The old woman wasn't just tired, she was discarded, as if her usefulness had been wrung out of her bones, and she was now walking herself to wherever forgotten people go. No bus route, no security escort, no coat thick enough to fight off the city's cold indifference. Just a plastic bag gripped like a lifeline, and a spine bent under the invisible weight of a nation's neglect. Jasmine's chest tightened. This wasn't policy anymore. This was proof. She stepped off the concrete ledge like she was crossing a boundary she could never uncross. Her car keys stayed buried in her coat pocket, untouched. She didn't want glass between them. She needed to feel this. She unwrapped her scarf, stuffed it into her bag, and adjusted the collar of her coat like a soldier readying for battle. Her heels, which had clicked confidently through congressional halls just hours before, now moved in near silence, each footstep deliberate, careful not to draw attention. The distance between her and the woman grew thinner with every block, but Jasmine kept back, never too close, always watching. The city around them was slowly decaying into shadows. Fast food wrappers in the gutters, graffiti bleeding down brick walls. windows glowing dimly with lives too tired to stay lit. Every step Jasmine took wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. She was descending from power into a kind of truth no bill on the Senate floor had ever truly captured. And for the first time all day, she wasn't speaking. She was listening, not with her ears, but with her eyes, her skin, and the cold that now cut straight to the bone. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was confrontation. Every step Jasmine took behind that frail figure was a descent into a side of the city that policy never touched and privilege refused to acknowledge. The woman walked with a strange kind of rhythm, slow, steady, and heartbreakingly rehearsed, like someone who had made the same journey through darkness too many times to count. She didn't look around. She didn't check her phone. She didn't hesitate at corners like someone waiting for a ride. She just kept moving forward, her plastic bag swaying with each step like a pendulum of survival. Jasmine followed at a cautious distance, every muscle in her body alert, not because she feared danger, but because she could feel it in the air. This wasn't a neighborhood, it was a wound. They had left behind the glossed-over parts of D.C., the polished sidewalks, the freshly painted row houses, the echoes of late-night joggers and luxury sedans. Now the streets narrowed, their surfaces cracked and uneven, lined with rusted fences and garbage bins overflowing from neglect. Street lamps buzzed overhead, some burned out entirely, others casting pale amber circles like dying moons. The buildings loomed closer together, brick chipped and window frames splintered, like teeth worn down from grinding too long in silence. Jasmine's breath slowed as she took it all in. Not just the place, but what it meant. These weren't just forgotten streets. They were erased, cut out from every congressional blueprint and gentrification pitch deck she'd ever seen. And yet here was this woman, tiny and trembling, walking them like they were the only thing left that still made sense. Jasmine's shoes sank slightly into a patch of wet asphalt, and for a moment she had to stop, her chest tightening, not from exhaustion, but from rage. This woman had cleaned floors beneath chandeliers, stocked shelves for senators, and likely smiled at strangers who would never remember her name. And now, after all that labor, she was walking through neighborhoods where even hope had packed up and left. Jasmine had spent years writing legislation for working-class Americans, had stood on podiums demanding equity, but nothing had ever prepared her for this. The raw geography of failure, mapped out in boarded-up windows and broken street signs. There was no metaphor here. There was only truth, and that truth walked 10 feet ahead of her, underdressed and overlooked, with a plastic bag clutched like it carried everything she had left. She had chased shadows across crumbling sidewalks, thinking she understood hardship. But as the woman reached that steel door, Jasmine Crockett realized this was not just poverty. It was exile sealed in rust and silence. The lot was barren, the kind of dead space cities ignore, wedged between two collapsing buildings and littered with old tires, broken glass, and the skeletal remains of things no one cared to reclaim. At the far edge of that void stood a shipping container, hunched and weather-stained, its paint blistered like old wounds that never healed. It bore no sign of habitation, no welcome mat, no number, no protection from the night, just steel and resignation. A single wire dangled from a utility pole nearby, looping into the container like a lifeline that could snap at any moment. The woman approached it without pause, like someone returning to a sentence, not a sanctuary. Jasmine halted beside a rusted fence, keeping her breath quiet as the door creaked open. The sound was hollow, metallic, like a verdict being handed down in the dark. She inched forward, careful not to be seen, until her eyes aligned with a narrow split between two warped metal panels. Inside, the air looked heavy. The walls were lined with old blankets stapled to the interior like failed insulation, and on the bare cement floor, two small children lay huddled beneath a single fleece throw, thin, fraying, and barely covering their legs. One was already awake, eyes wide open but lifeless, staring at the door as if hoping it might bring warmth or food. The other stirred weakly at the sound of their grandmother entering. The woman said nothing. She knelt beside them, her knees hitting the concrete with a soft thud that made Jasmine flinch. From the plastic bag, she withdrew two bruised bananas and a loaf of bread, with one corner missing. Her hands moved with a gentleness Jasmine couldn't bear to watch, dividing the bread into 3 sections, folding the ends like she was trying to make them look fuller. She gave the fruit to the children and kept nothing for herself. And that was when Jasmine felt it. Not just sorrow, but rage. This was what the debates sanitized. This was what got flattened into bullet points and bar graphs. This was the America no one televised. No hot meals, no beds, no heat. Just a woman who had mopped floors for a decade, feeding children dinner like it was a secret. Jasmine's pulse pounded in her ears. She had sat in rooms where men in suits discussed the working class like a demographic target. But now she saw it up close, cold, hungry, and contained in a box on borrowed land. This wasn't hardship. This was abandonment. And it was happening just 5 miles from the Capitol Dome. Up until now, Jasmine had followed in silence, observing, processing, enduring. But the next few moments inside that rusted shell of survival would not simply wound her, they would redefine her. The woman didn't eat. She didn't even pretend to. Instead, she offered the bread and bananas like a sacred rite, placing each piece gently into the children's hands, as if afraid the food might crumble under the weight of her tenderness. The older child, maybe 10 at most, gave her a puzzled glance and glanced at the near-empty bag. The woman noticed, but she was ready. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that tried to erase suffering, not with joy, but with discipline. "I had some rice at work, baby," she said softly, brushing a hand over his cheek like a blessing. Jasmine saw the lie land gently, accepted without question, because the children had already learned not to ask too much. The woman sat back, her eyes never leaving their faces as they devoured the modest meal with the hunger of those who know there might not be a next one. Her stomach never growled. Her hands stayed folded. But her face trembled at the edges, a performance of peace unraveling in slow motion. It wasn't the absence of food that broke Jasmine. It was the presence of dignity in the absence of everything else. She turned away from the narrow viewing slit like she'd been struck in the chest. Her hand flew to her mouth, not just to stifle a sob, but to contain something deeper: shame, fury, helplessness, all detonating at once. Her vision blurred, but she didn't blink. She couldn't. Every policy white paper she'd ever read on poverty statistics flashed in her mind like ash. Sterile numbers that suddenly felt insulting in their cold detachment. This wasn't 12.6% child food insecurity. This was two faces in the dark, being lied to out of love. This wasn't a policy failure. This was a moral collapse. Jasmine had fought for labor protections, spoken on House floors about wage gaps, lobbied for child nutrition bills, and yet here she was, 5 miles from Capitol Hill, watching a woman lie to her grandchildren so they wouldn't offer her a bite of bread. Her hands clenched. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven gasps. This wasn't just a broken system. It was a system designed never to see this. But Jasmine saw it now. God help her. She saw it all. The day after witnessing Estella's quiet sacrifice, Jasmine stepped into the store not as a congresswoman, but as a witness to a broken system that had abandoned the very people it was supposed to protect. Her boots clicked against the tile floor, the sharp sound amplifying in the silence, as though the walls themselves could sense what was about to unfold. She walked past the aisles of chips and canned goods, eyes fixed on the counter where the manager, a man in his 40s with an air of weariness about him, stood, his expression blank. The instant he saw her, his face shifted, the recognition flickering in his eyes before being quickly masked by a smile that felt too practiced, too artificial. He greeted her in his usual manner, but there was an underlying tension in his voice, an awareness that something more was being asked than just a simple question. "I need to talk to you about one of your employees," Jasmine said, her voice controlled but firm. The manager blinked, visibly taken aback by her directness. His shoulders stiffened as he leaned back against the counter, his posture defensive. "Estella Reyes, the woman who works the late shift," she continued, her gaze piercing him as she studied his every move. He hesitated, eyes quickly flicking around the store, searching for an escape in the familiar surroundings. Finally he spoke, his voice slower than usual, as though calculating the consequences of the conversation. "Estella, Yeah, she's been with us about 12 years now. Always on time, never asked for time off, always puts in a full shift. He seemed proud of these facts, as though they were merits worthy of recognition. Jasmine didn't need to hear more. She knew what those words meant. 12 years of loyalty to a company that saw Stella as nothing more than a disposable tool, and in return, she was barely able to feed herself. And she's part-time, right? Jasmine's voice cut through the surface pleasantries. The manager's face faltered for a moment before he nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, an understanding that this wasn't just an inquiry, but an accusation. Minimum wage, he added quickly, almost defensively, as though he needed to justify it. But those two words landed like bricks. She's not eligible for benefits either. Not full-time, so no health care, no paid leave. That's just how it works here. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. 12 years of tireless work, and Estella was still living paycheck to paycheck, denied the very benefits that would allow her to survive with dignity. Her stomach twisted with fury, not just at the store, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. Estella had dedicated her body and spirit to making the store run smoothly, to being the invisible backbone of the service economy. She had scrubbed floors for thousands of people, yet in return, she was left hungry, working every day without the assurance of a future. The weight of it all hit Jasmine like a punch to the gut. The injustice wasn't just that Estella was underpaid, it was that she was invisible. A nameless face behind the counter whose years of sacrifice had earned her nothing but an endless struggle to survive. The system had closed its eyes to her, reduced her to a part-time label that barely defined who she was, much less what she was worth. Jasmine clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. This wasn't just a wage disparity. It was an erasure of humanity. Estella wasn't allowed to have dignity, let alone security. Her mind raced as she thought of how many more Estellas were out there, hidden in plain sight, working themselves to the bone, and receiving nothing in return but more work. She thought of how many more people had been condemned to this cycle of exploitation. She had spent years speaking about inequality, about the disparity between the rich and the poor, about systemic abuse. But standing here, hearing this cold, heartless truth, she realized that the true scale of the injustice wasn't something that could be fixed with a bill or a speech. The problem was far deeper than legislation. It was about a system that refused to value its people. Jasmine took a slow breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "How much longer do you think she can keep doing this?" she asked, her voice low but carrying a weight that made the manager shift uncomfortably under her gaze. He didn't answer, his eyes now avoiding hers, unwilling to face the reality that Jasmine was forcing him to see. Jasmine didn't need him to respond. She already knew the answer. As long as the system allowed her to, Estella would keep going, buried under the weight of a system that cared only for profit. The realization hit Jasmine harder than she expected. It wasn't just a broken system, it was a soul-crushing cycle. Estella had been stripped of her humanity by a world that didn't care if she lived or died, as long as she kept working. Jasmine's chest tightened as her thoughts turned over in her mind, grappling with the immense scale of the injustice. The realization was clear. This wasn't just about Estella. This was about everyone who had been cast aside, whose voices had been drowned out by the noise of the rich and powerful. Her hands trembled with anger. Jasmine's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to walk away. She couldn't. The world could ignore the Estellas for as long as it wanted, but she wasn't going to let them stay invisible. She would fight for her, and for every person who had been erased from the system's view. The fire that burned inside her wasn't just about anger. It was about action. She was ready, and she wouldn't rest until the world saw what she had seen, felt what she had felt, and finally understood the cost of leaving people like Estella behind. That night, the weight of everything Jasmine had witnessed surged within her. This wasn't about policy or speeches. It was about standing face to face with the broken system that had ignored Estella for far too long. Jasmine stood quietly at the edge of the parking lot, the night air cold and crisp against her skin. The store was nearly empty now, the hum of the fluorescent lights inside the only sound breaking the stillness. She had waited for what felt like hours, watching as the shadows deepened around her. There was no hurry, no rush. This moment wasn't about a ticking clock or a set agenda. It was about something raw, about human connection, about seeing someone for the first time when everyone else had looked away. Estella's shift was ending, and Jasmine's heart raced with a mix of anticipation and fear. Fear of what she might say, and fear of the responsibility that had slowly settled in her chest like a heavy stone. When the door creaked open and Estella emerged, the tired woman barely lifted her head, dragging her feet as she made her way to the lot. Her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of exhaustion, and for a moment she looked smaller than she had before, as though the very act of surviving another day had hollowed her out. She didn't see Jasmine immediately, her eyes focused on the ground in front of her, lost in a world that had kept her invisible for too long. The moment stretched between them, and Jasmine felt the gravity of what she had come to do. "Excuse me." Jasmine's voice broke the stillness, soft but firm. Estella looked up quickly, startled, her face a mix of confusion and wariness. She was used to being ignored, used to moving through the world without anyone truly noticing her. Jasmine stepped forward slowly, careful not to startle her, but steady in her intent. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was her chance to do what no one else had done. See her. "I'm Jasmine," she said, offering a small, sincere smile, one that didn't carry the weight of power or expectation, but simply the truth. "I'm not here as a congresswoman," Jasmine continued, her voice carrying a softness that matched the calmness of the night. "I'm here as someone who cares." Estella blinked, a look of disbelief crossing her face. She didn't know how to react. No one had ever approached her like this before. No one had ever seen her beyond the floors she scrubbed or the shelves she stocked. No one had ever acknowledged the humanity beneath the exhaustion. Jasmine watched her carefully, giving her space, allowing her to process. The woman before her was wary, her face hardened by years of neglect, her eyes searching for the familiar safety of detachment. The emotional armor she'd perfected through years of hardship. Jasmine understood. She knew the walls that had been built, but Jasmine didn't back away. She took a step closer, not as an authority figure or someone with the power to change the world with a single conversation, but as a person who saw beyond the worn apron, beyond the tired eyes. She saw the woman who had spent 12 years of her life giving everything and receiving nothing in return. And she wanted Estella to know that her struggle was not invisible, that she mattered, that someone finally was paying attention. "If you ever need anything," Jasmine said, her voice quiet but unwavering, "please don't hesitate to reach out. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I'm here for you." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of all the injustices Jasmine had seen and felt. It was a promise, not of grand gestures, but of a willingness to be present, to listen, to care. Estella's eyes softened as she took in the words, a flicker of something vulnerable passing over her face. The exhaustion that had settled into her features began to shift, not gone, but lighter, as though the burden of invisibility had been momentarily lifted. For a moment, Estella said nothing. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Jasmine could see the hesitation, the disbelief in her eyes, the uncertainty of being allowed to matter in a world that had never given her permission to. Jasmine didn't rush her. She stood quietly, offering only her presence, offering Estella the space to decide whether to trust this moment, whether to trust that someone finally saw her, not as a worker, not as a part-time employee, but as a person. Finally, Estella nodded slightly, her expression still guarded, but the faintest trace of relief in her eyes. There was no grand declaration, no immediate change, but there was a shift, a subtle, powerful moment of connection. Jasmine gave her a small nod in return, a silent understanding passing between them. She had done what no one else had. She had stepped outside the boundaries of her position, of her power, and simply offered something real. The night was still, the world outside the parking lot moving as if nothing had changed. But for Jasmine and Estella, something had shifted, and Jasmine knew, as she walked away, that this was just the beginning. What Jasmine had seen, what she had felt, demanded more than just words. It demanded action, quiet and relentless, because the broken system she had witnessed wasn't going to change itself. Jasmine didn't call for cameras. She didn't want the press buzzing around, making a spectacle of Estella's pain, her struggle. This wasn't about attention. This wasn't about visibility. This was about real, sustained change. And change didn't come in the form of headlines and hashtags. It came quietly, like a ripple on the surface of an ocean that, over time, would move mountains. Jasmine knew that. She had seen too many moments of fleeting fame, too many broken promises made in front of flashing lights. This time, it would be different. She sat at her desk that evening, the soft hum of the city outside her window reminding her that the world continued to spin, oblivious to the injustices she had just witnessed. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began typing. First, a quick message to a nonprofit she knew that worked on housing assistance. Then a call to a friend who had connections with local education foundations. She moved quickly but with care. Each outreach calculated, each connection made with the same quiet urgency. No fanfare, no public rallying cry. Just one person doing what she could to make another's life a little more bearable. Hours passed, and as the evening bled into the night, Jasmine's efforts began to take shape. She didn't wait for answers from the organizations. She knew what she was doing was right, even if it was all happening behind closed doors. This was how it would be done. There would be no grand declarations, no speeches in front of cameras. She would fix what had been broken. She would fight for Estella, not with words, but with results. By the following afternoon, she had secured a small renovated apartment in a quiet, residential neighborhood, a mere 10-minute walk from a well-rated public school. The apartment had everything it needed, a kitchen stocked with the essentials, fresh paint on the walls, clean floors beneath their feet. The rent had already been paid for 6 months, and Jasmine had made sure that the utilities, water, electricity, heat, were all set up, the bills already covered for the year. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Estella and her children a new beginning, a chance to start over without the constant weight of survival hanging over them. Jasmine had spent hours on the phone, arranging for the apartment, coordinating with the right people to ensure everything was handled discreetly and efficiently. There was no need for fanfare, no need for anyone to know her name. She just wanted to make sure that Estella would have a roof over her head, a safe space where she could rest at night and not worry about where her next meal would come from. Jasmine didn't ask for anything in return. The system had failed Estella. Now it was up to her, Jasmine Crockett, not as a congresswoman, but as a human being who refused to stand by and do nothing. In addition to securing the apartment, Jasmine turned her attention to Estella's children. The weight of their future hung heavy on her heart. They were children, innocent and full of potential, yet bound by the same system that had failed their mother. The only difference between them and countless other children was that they had been born into a life of hardship, a life where the promise of opportunity felt like a distant dream. Jasmine refused to let them fall through the cracks, as so many did. She immediately set up a scholarship fund for their education. She worked with local foundations, making sure that both children would have the resources they needed to succeed academically. Tuition covered, school supplies provided, extracurricular activities supported. Jasmine even made calls to a local health clinic, arranging for medical care for Estella and her children. They would have access to the health care they deserved, without the burden of worrying about whether they could afford it. Jasmine didn't want them to just survive. She wanted them to thrive. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, relentless determination. Jasmine didn't stop. She didn't slow down. Every email she sent, every phone call she made, every connection she fostered, it was all for Estella and her family. Jasmine knew this would be a long battle. She knew that this was just the beginning. The system that had allowed Estella to slip through the cracks wouldn't change overnight. But what Jasmine had learned in the quiet after the storm was that real change didn't need to come from the top down. It could come from the ground up, and she was going to build it, one brick at a time. By the time Estella was able to move into her new home, Jasmine had already lined up everything she needed: bills covered, education supported, healthcare in place. Estella had no idea what Jasmine had done, nor did she need to. This was not for recognition. It was for dignity. It was for a future where Estella could rest, not having to fight every day just to survive. It was a chance to rebuild, to start anew. Jasmine hadn't just offered a handout. She had offered a future, something far more precious than any temporary fix. The night before Stella's family was to move into the new apartment, Jasmine stood in the quiet of her office, staring out the window at the city lights. She could feel the weight of what she had done settle over her like a warm blanket. But there was no satisfaction in it, only the knowledge that one woman's suffering had been alleviated. But there were still millions more out there, slipping through the cracks just like Estella had. The work wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jasmine knew that her role in this wasn't a singular act of charity. It was part of something bigger, part of a systemic change that had to be made. She couldn't change everything overnight, but she could make sure that at least one person, one family, could stand tall again, with dignity and hope for the future. And in that moment, Jasmine knew that this was the kind of fight she was meant for. Fighting not just for the spotlight, but for the quiet, unseen battles that shaped the world. The next morning she woke early, her resolve as sharp as ever. There was much more to be done, but for now, as she stood in front of Estella's new home, she knew she had made a real difference, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her purpose clear and steady. A week had passed since Jasmine's quiet, relentless work had begun to take shape, and now the moment she had been working for was finally here. But it was not without the weight of the world on her shoulders. Jasmine stood outside the door of the small, run-down building where Estella worked. The world was moving quickly around her, people coming and going, the usual noise of the city humming in the background. But Jasmine felt the stillness around her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest as she held the envelope tightly in her hands. It had been a week since she had taken those first steps to change Estella's life, and now standing here, Jasmine's heart raced. Today wasn't about headlines or political speeches. This was about dignity. This was about showing a woman who had given everything, who had been denied for so long, that she mattered. The door swung open with a soft squeak, and there Estella stood, her tired face lighting up with surprise at the sight of Jasmine. She looked the same, worn from the world, shoulders slumped in exhaustion, yet still carrying that quiet resilience that had pulled her through 12 years of unnoticed labor. She wasn't expecting anything. Why would she? No one had ever given her a reason to expect kindness. No one had ever given her the chance to dream of something better. "Estella," Jasmine said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything she had worked for. "I've got something for you." Estella blinked, confused as Jasmine handed her the envelope. For a moment it seemed as if time itself had stopped. Estella's hands hesitated, as though uncertain whether to accept the envelope at all. But then she slowly took it from Jasmine's outstretched hand, her fingers brushing against the paper, almost as if afraid of what was inside. She stared at the envelope, her mind racing with questions, doubt creeping in with every second that passed. This wasn't a world where people just handed out things like this. Estella had never been given anything without having to fight for it, without having to earn it, with nothing ever handed to her on a silver platter. She had no reason to think this would be different. Jasmine stepped back, giving Estella the space she needed, but never losing sight of her. Estella stood there frozen, looking at the envelope as though it were a mystery she couldn't unravel. Finally, her hands began to tremble, and she tore open the envelope slowly. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, knowing what was coming, but still holding her breath in anticipation. The moment Estella unfolded the piece of paper, her eyes widened. For the first time in what felt like forever, a light of disbelief flashed across her face, a spark of something close to hope. Her breath hitched, her hands shaking so violently now that the paper threatened to slip from her grasp. The address of the new apartment, the paid rent, the utilities taken care of, everything that Jasmine had set up for Estella's new beginning, all laid out on a single sheet of paper. But for Estella, it wasn't just an address. It was a lifeline. It was proof that someone had seen her. It was proof that she mattered. Estella's eyes welled up with tears, and in that instant, Jasmine could see the dam that had been holding her back break. Estella's body trembled as the weight of the revelation hit her. The truth of what Jasmine had done, the gesture of humanity, of kindness, of real, tangible help, was too much for Estella to process all at once. She dropped the paper, her hands flying to her face as tears began to spill down her cheeks. She couldn't speak at first, her body racked with sobs that she had held in for too long. She had been living in a world where survival meant closing off everything, where hope was something others had, but never her. Now all of that was crashing down in a rush of overwhelming emotion. Without warning, Estella stepped forward and enveloped Jasmine in a fierce, desperate hug, clinging to her as if she could absorb this moment, this reality, and make it her own. Jasmine's chest tightened at the rawness of the embrace, the woman she had fought for finally breaking free of the years of struggle that had defined her life. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air like a storm, both of them holding on to the moment as if it were the only thing that could ground them. Estella pulled back slightly, her face red from crying, her eyes wide with disbelief, as though she still couldn't quite understand what had just happened. She looked at Jasmine, her voice barely a whisper, but the words carrying the weight of a lifetime. "I don't deserve this," she choked out, her words cracking under the strain of emotion. "I don't deserve this kindness." Jasmine's heart broke a little more at those words. No, Estella didn't deserve to be in this position, but she had never been given the chance to feel worthy of this kind of kindness, of this kind of grace. Jasmine took a step closer, lifting Estella's chin gently so their eyes met. The anger that had been bubbling inside her over the past week, the fury at a system that had allowed this to happen, was now tempered by a fierce determination. "You do deserve this," Jasmine said, her voice low but firm. "You don't just deserve it, Estella. You are an inspiration. You've given everything for your family, for your community, and no one ever gave you a reason to believe you mattered. But you do, and that is why I'm here. Because you've shown me what real strength is. I'm just doing what's right." Estella's lip trembled as she absorbed the weight of Jasmine's words. She shook her head in disbelief, tears still spilling down her cheeks, but a soft smile began to tug at the corners of her lips. This wasn't just relief. It was the first real sense of hope she had felt in years. And it was because someone had seen her, not as a worker, not as a problem, but as a human being, worthy of dignity, love, and care. For a long time, Jasmine stood there, not saying anything more, allowing the silence to speak for them. Estella wasn't ready for grand speeches. She wasn't ready to hear more words about justice or politics. All she needed was this, a moment of truth, of being seen, and Jasmine had made sure it was real. As the two women stood together, the weight of a broken system momentarily lifted. Jasmine knew that this was only the beginning. The fight would continue, but for now Estella had something that had been denied to her for so long. Hope. And in that hope, Jasmine could see the future. A future where maybe the system would change, where more people like Estella wouldn't have to fight for their dignity. But for now, this was enough, and in this moment, Jasmine felt more alive, more connected to her purpose than she ever had before. She had made a difference, and that, she thought, was worth everything. The next morning, Estella's family stepped into the new apartment. But what Jasmine saw unfold before her eyes wasn't just a new chapter. It was the raw reality of what was possible when someone cared enough to make a difference. Jasmine stood across the street, her gaze fixed on the small apartment building where Estella's family was about to begin a new life. The morning light had begun to warm the cool air, but Jasmine's heart felt heavy, anchored by the weight of what she had seen. She had watched the transformation of Estella's world from one of hardship and despair to a space filled with the potential for something better. It wasn't much, a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, but for Estella and her children, it was everything. The door to the apartment building swung open, and Estella stepped out with her two children, their faces unsure but filled with the kind of hope that only comes with the promise of change. Estella's eyes scanned the space, almost as if she couldn't believe it. It was a scene so simple, so ordinary, yet so extraordinary in the context of everything that had led to this moment. The children, barely old enough to understand what was happening, suddenly broke into laughter, their voices echoing against the walls of the building. One of the children ran ahead, slapping his hand against the walls, As if testing the reality of this new space, he jumped onto the carpet with such abandon as if it were a trampoline. His sister followed closely, her eyes wide, her face alight with disbelief. She tugged at Estella's sleeve, pulling her mother's attention to the bare walls, to the simple furniture already placed in the living room, to the untouched kitchen counters and the fresh, clean air of their new home. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they weren't just surviving, they were living. Jasmine watched quietly from across the street, her hands folded together, but her eyes sharp. She didn't take out her phone. She didn't snap a photo. She didn't start a live stream. There was no need for public validation, no need to parade this moment as a spectacle for the world to see. This wasn't about generating clicks or collecting applause. It was about the truth of what was happening. This was about a woman who had been neglected by the system, who had been told for years that her worth didn't matter, now getting a chance to rebuild her life. And Jasmine knew that no camera could capture the significance of this moment. The joy in the children's laughter, the hope on Estella's face, was far more powerful than any viral video could ever be. As Estella and the children made their way inside the apartment, Jasmine took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling with the images of the countless families, the countless workers, who never got this chance. She could have easily posted a picture, shown the world what she had done, what she had accomplished. But as she stood there, she understood something much more profound. This wasn't about headlines. This wasn't about spreading a message for the sake of approval. It was about dignity, real, tangible dignity. A dignity that couldn't be reduced to a catchy hashtag or a viral post. This was about giving Estella and her children the chance to live a life where their worth wasn't defined by the hours they worked, the sweat they poured into their jobs, or the debt they carried. Jasmine turned to her assistant, who had been standing quietly beside her. The assistant had been with her through every step of this journey, helping with logistics, calls, and making sure every detail had been taken care of. Jasmine could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment hanging between them. She looked at her assistant and spoke softly but firmly, the words carrying the depth of everything she had just witnessed. "We don't need cameras," Jasmine said, her voice calm but resolute. "We need real justice. We need a justice that's not just for show, but for people like Estella, people who have been ignored and forgotten for too long. This isn't about me, and it's not about getting credit. It's about making sure that people like her, the ones who make this country run, are given the life they deserve." Her assistant nodded, understanding exactly what Jasmine meant. They had both been through too many meetings, too many speeches, too many empty promises from politicians who had never had to live through what Estella had lived through. Jasmine knew that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. There were millions more families out there, hidden in the shadows of a broken system, and Jasmine knew, deep in her bones, that the work would continue. It had to. The children's laughter filtered through the air, reaching Jasmine's ears. Estella appeared in the doorway of the apartment, her eyes bright, her shoulders a little less burdened than they had been a week ago. She looked over at Jasmine, a soft smile forming on her lips, and for a moment there was nothing else in the world. No politics, no systems, just a woman and her children, standing at the threshold of a new life. Jasmine smiled back, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. This was why she did this, why she fought. Not for headlines, not for praise, but for moments like this. For the chance to give someone back their dignity, to show them that they mattered. She didn't need anyone to see this. She didn't need validation. This was the kind of justice that lived in the quiet moments, in the spaces where no one was looking. This was the kind of change that, once set in motion, could never be undone. As Estella and her children moved further into the apartment, their laughter echoing, Jasmine took one last look at the building that now symbolized something far greater than the sum of its walls and windows. It symbolized the beginning of a new future, a future where people like Estella, who had been forced to sacrifice everything for so long, could finally be given the space to live. Jasmine knew, as she turned and walked away, that the fight would continue, just as it always had. But for now she could rest, not because the battle was over, but because, in that moment, she had won something real. She had given a family the gift of hope. And in a world that often seems built on taking from those who have nothing, That was a victory worth more than any victory she could win on a campaign stage. As the door to Estella's new home closed softly behind her, Jasmine stood there, the weight of her quiet victory settling in. But she knew deep down that what they had achieved wasn't enough. The lesson was clear, painful, and undeniable. This was only one moment in a battle that would take far more than just one act of kindness. The world around Jasmine seemed to blur as she turned away from the apartment building, her mind still processing everything that had just happened. Estella's family, full of joy and disbelief, now had the chance to live in a place they could call home. But that truth, their truth, was a rare exception. Jasmine could feel the burn of frustration in her chest as she walked, each step echoing with the weight of the injustice she had witnessed. Every day, thousands of people like Estella lived in shadows, their struggles invisible to a society that chose not to see them. Estella had fought for her family, had survived the overwhelming burden of poverty for 12 years. But how many others had been left behind, forgotten by the system that was supposed to serve them? The work was far from over. Jasmine could feel the pressure of that truth pushing against her ribs. She had done something good, something that mattered for Estella and her children. But that act of charity was only a temporary solution to a much deeper problem. She had made a difference in their lives, but how many others were still out there, fighting the same fight, with no one to give them a helping hand? The injustice of it all consumed her thoughts as she walked, her pace quickening, the fire of righteous anger burning deeper with every step. The system that had allowed Estella to slip through the cracks, that had labeled her as part-time and dismissed her as nothing more than a cog in the machine, was still in place. The corporation that paid her minimum wage, that kept her hours short so they wouldn't have to offer benefits, was still profiting off the labor of people like Estella. Jasmine clenched her fists as she walked, her knuckles white against the tension in her hands. How was this allowed to happen? How was it that hardworking people like Estella could spend years building the foundation of their community, only to be cast aside when they were no longer needed? How could society allow people to work themselves to the bone and still live in fear of not being able to feed their families, to survive the next week? Jasmine felt a fire stirring within her, and for a moment she stopped walking, her breath heavy as she faced the reality she had been trying to ignore. The injustice she had seen wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. It was the design of a system that was built to keep the wealthy in power and the rest of the world struggling to survive. Every time she heard someone talk about economic growth or productivity, she saw Estella's tired face, her cracked hands, her empty stomach, and the lie of a system that promised opportunity but only delivered exploitation. Jasmine had lived in that world of politics and corporate speeches, of false promises and empty gestures, and now she could see clearly that it wasn't enough. She was one person, but the power of the system was vast. It spread through every institution, every law, every policy, every corporation. And for the first time, Jasmine realized that this wasn't just a battle against individuals. This was a war against an entire structure, one that had been built over decades and had become so entrenched that it was almost invisible to those who benefited from it. The very system that had allowed Estella to be mistreated had also allowed Jasmine herself to succeed. She had been born into a different set of privileges, a different set of opportunities. And she was angry. Angry at the world for allowing so many people to be left behind, for allowing them to be treated like they didn't matter, like their lives were worth less than the profit of a corporation. But even in the face of that anger, Jasmine knew she couldn't simply burn the system down and walk away. It wasn't that simple. This was not a fight that could be won with a single act of defiance or with a single person standing up to make a difference. It was a war, a battle that would require everyone who cared about justice to step up and fight. She couldn't change the system overnight, but she could use her voice, her position, her platform to raise awareness, to demand accountability, and to make sure that stories like Estella's weren't silenced. Jasmine walked into the office later that day, her mind still swirling with the weight of the lesson she had just learned. Her assistant was already at her desk, organizing papers and answering calls, but the moment she saw Jasmine, she knew something had changed. There was a new fire in Jasmine's eyes, a new determination that hadn't been there before. She had always been a fighter, but now she had a new clarity. She knew exactly what needed to be done, and she wasn't going to stop until it was done. "We need to do more," Jasmine said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. The assistant nodded, sensing the shift in her. Jasmine continued, her words gaining strength as she spoke. "We can't just keep handing out solutions to the people who need them most. We need to dismantle the system that has kept them in this place for so long. We need to build a world where people like Estella can thrive, not just survive. A world where no one has to choose between working themselves to death and feeding their family." The assistant looked at Jasmine, a mix of admiration and understanding in her eyes. Jasmine's words were not just a call for action, they were a battle cry. The fight had moved from personal charity to systemic change, and there was no going back. Jasmine was done playing by the rules of a broken system. It was time to rewrite the rules. Time to take the fight to the root of the problem. As the days passed, Jasmine's resolve hardened. She used her platform, her connections, and her voice to rally support for policies that would protect workers like Estella, policies that would guarantee fair wages, benefits, and protections for those who had been left behind for too long. She fought for affordable housing, for education, for healthcare, things that should have been guaranteed to every citizen but had been treated as luxuries instead of rights. Jasmine knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew the battle would be long and hard. But she also knew that if she didn't fight for justice, then who would? Her first step was to meet with lawmakers, pushing for new legislation that would hold corporations accountable for the way they treated their workers. She didn't back down when the opposition fought her at every turn. Every time someone told her it couldn't be done, she pressed harder. She knew the system could change, but it would take more than just a few people to make it happen. It would take every voice, every hand, every heart that believed in justice. Jasmine knew that Estella's victory wasn't just for Estella. It was for every worker, every mother, every child who had ever been denied their due. This was a victory that extended far beyond a single family, a single apartment. It was a victory that could ripple across the nation, shaking the foundations of the system that had kept so many in chains for so long. And Jasmine wasn't going to stop until that ripple became a tidal wave. As she walked into her office, her thoughts steady and her path clear, Jasmine smiled softly to herself. She had fought one battle, but the war? That was just beginning. And this time, she would make sure the world saw it for what it was. She would make sure no one was forgotten. Jasmine had made her stand. And now the real work was about to begin. The system that had kept people like Estella in the shadows for so long was going to face the light, whether it liked it or not. Jasmine stood before the chamber, her heart pounding in her chest but her voice unyielding. She had spent her entire career navigating the corridors of power, but today was different. Today she wasn't here to play the game. She wasn't here to placate anyone. Today she was here to fight for justice, the injustice she had witnessed in Estella's life. The quiet suffering of workers who were exploited, ignored, and abandoned had ignited something in Jasmine. It wasn't just about Estella anymore. It was about all the Estellas out there, the people who kept the world turning while the system ground them into dust. The lights above hummed in the silence of the room, the tension thick in the air as Jasmine took the microphone. She looked around at the faces before her. Lawmakers, corporate sponsors, lobbyists, all of them invested in the status quo. But Jasmine wasn't afraid. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "We've heard enough speeches," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had seen and felt. "We've heard enough promises. What we need now is action." Her words cut through the room like a blade, and she could feel the room stiffen. They weren't expecting this. They weren't expecting her to speak like this, to confront them with the truth of what was happening just outside these walls. "For far too long," Jasmine continued, her voice rising, "the people who make this country run have been treated like they don't matter. We've built this system on their backs, and we've left them to rot in poverty, to suffer in silence. And for what? For a few more dollars in the pockets of those who already have everything?" The room shifted uncomfortably, and Jasmine saw their eyes flicker nervously. She could feel the shift, the realization that they weren't going to escape this. Not today. You've all turned a blind eye to the suffering of millions of people. People like Estella, who have worked day in and day out, only to be told they don't matter. Well, I'm here to tell you they do matter. They matter more than your profits. They matter more than your bottom line. And we are done waiting. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. But Jasmine didn't break. She stood tall, her voice unwavering. You have a choice to make, she said, looking directly at the lawmakers. You can continue to ignore the people who make this economy run, or you can stand with them, with us, and fight for what's right. But you can't have it both ways. You can't keep pretending that everything is fine when families like Estella's are living in fear, living in the margins, barely scraping by. That ends now. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. Jasmine had never been more certain of her purpose than she was in this moment. She wasn't speaking for herself anymore. She wasn't just trying to make a point. She was speaking for all the people who had been left behind, all the workers who had given everything and received nothing in return. We don't need more empty words, Jasmine said, her voice low but powerful. We need real action. We need fair wages. We need health care for all. And we need a system that doesn't just protect the rich and powerful, but that protects everyone. We need justice. Now. The room was still, but Jasmine could feel it. Something was shifting. The power was no longer just with the politicians and the corporations. The power was with the people. It had always been with the people. And now, finally, they were starting to realize that. Jasmine took a breath, steadying herself before she finished. This isn't about me. This isn't about making headlines. This is about doing what's right. And if you can't do that, if you can't stand up for the people who need it most, then maybe it's time for you to step aside. She turned to leave the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their validation. She had already made her stand, and she knew deep down that it was the right one. The fight for Estella and everyone like her had only just begun. And this time, Jasmine wouldn't stop until the world saw them, until they were finally given the justice they deserved. As she walked out of the chamber, Jasmine felt the weight of the battle ahead, but she was ready. She was more determined than ever. The fight for justice had only just begun, and nothing would stop her. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.